Okay, we're live. So Claudia, you can take it away.
All right, thank you. So happy to have all of you here today. We're going to have Tomazio Portizzo is going to present the research on the human side of structural transformation, and Federico is here also to answer questions in the Q&A. So just a reminder of how this talk works. So Tomazio will have 45 minutes to give the talk. While he's talking, if you want to put questions in the Q&A, that'd be great. And then the last 15 minutes, we'll have time for people to ask their questions and have both the speakers respond to them. And then we will have time after that if people want to stick around and have a more informal conversation with the authors. So, okay, well, why don't you take it away? Thanks.
Thank you so much for having us here. It is a real pleasure to present my work with Federico and Gabriella. So, one of the most fundamental regularities really of economic growth is that it comes hand in hand with labor reallocation away from agricultural production into manufacturing and then services. And looking back at the last 50, 100 years in the last few decades, really we have seen millions, if not billions of workers moving out of agricultural employment as countries developed. And so, and of course, we're not the first to notice this. So there is a very extensive literature that have studied the sources of sectoral labor reallocation. And in particular, there are two core explanations that have been put forward to understand why, as countries develop, labor moves out of agriculture. The first one is the idea of unbalanced productivity growth. So the idea is that as countries develop, they become relatively more productive at producing agricultural goods, and hence they just don't need that much labor in agriculture. The second is the idea of income effect playing out through normothetic demand. So as countries develop, individuals demand relatively less agricultural goods. So very intuitive, if you are well-fed, you want to buy goods or services, no more agricultural goods. And again, as a result, less labor is needed in agriculture. So both these prominent explanations have something fundamental in common. That is that they lead to a decline in the demand for workers from the agricultural sector. And in fact, the structural change literature as a whole, with very few exceptions, such as Caselli-Coleman, really have modeled labor as a commodity, which means that workers were just modeled as free to reallocate across sectors, and their skills are essentially assumed to be equally valuable everywhere. So labor is really just in the background. Now, what we do in this paper? Well, in this paper, we depart from this perspective, so having labor in the background, and bring back workers, or what we call the human side, so that's why the title, at the center. So in other words, what we do is we study shifts in the supply of agricultural labor, not only in the demand for agricultural workers. And really, in doing so, we are motivated by the dramatic increase in human capital that essentially defined the second half of the 20th century. So the idea is that as people spend more time in school, they accumulate skills that are more valued out of agriculture, and hence we may expect this to lead to a shift in the aggregate competitive advantage, which then will manifest itself into decline in the supply of agricultural labor. Or in other words, in a decline in the willingness of workers to stay in agriculture for a given wages per efficiency unit. Again, why? Well, because as well known, human capital is more useful outside of agriculture. So really, our key contribution in this paper, it is to quantify within a unified framework changes in both supply and demand of agricultural workers, and show that they both matters in order to understand the aggregate. So not previous demand focus on the demand, we take that into account in our framework, but we show that the supply side matters as well. So before moving forward and showing you exactly what we do, it is important to do a clarification about the nature of our exercise. So of course, as probably you're already thinking, the increase in human capital in the last century was at least partially endogenous, simply the result of individuals responding to changes in economic condition. And the result in our paper does not contradict that. In fact, our results are going to be consistent with the hypothesis that there is one unique deep driver of structural transformation, namely productivity growth, which then may manifest itself through endogenous increase in human capital, which in turn shift the supply. still, like, we argue that, like, it matters to take the supply side into account. Why? Because, for example, like, policies or other, like, economic events that may affect kind of human capital accumulation may, as a byproduct, lead to shift in the supply of agricultural labor, hence kind of like, lead to structural transformation and potentially eventually economic growth. Okay, so that's kind of like, the very big picture. Now let's zoom into, in practice, what we do. So I'll try to kind of give you an overview of the kind of like core results of the paper in like, all like in this slide. So the first part of the paper is really like an empirical exercise in which we use micro level data from more than 60 countries around the world to decompose the aggregate labor reallocation out of agriculture. So our starting point is this graph over here, which shows the agricultural employment as a function of, like, time, separate for 3 groups of countries: high, middle, and low income countries. And what we see in this graph, very well known, is that agricultural employment kind of declined over time. Now, this is an aggregate perspective. What we can do with the micro data, it is we can unpack, we can statistically decompose this into labor reallocation within and between birth cohort, or statistically into year and cohorts effect. So, whoops. So here we start from, like, the within cohort component. So what this figure shows is that once we follow, like, one cohort over time, so this essentially is like, this path here, following, like, cohorts over time, we see like the lower reallocation relative than, like, the aggregate. And why that's the case? Well, because the aggregate is partly the result of compositional effect, which you can see, like, here on the right figure. So what we are showing here, we are showing the agricultural employment as a function of the age in which a birth cohort is born. So again, this is the within cohort following one cohort over time. This is the between cohort, which means comparing young and less young birth cohort. What we can see from this picture is that younger individuals throughout, like, the world are less likely to work in agriculture within any given year. Okay, so now the statistical decomposition allows us to also kind of, assign the contribution of each one of these 2 objects to the aggregate. And what we find is that the cohort component accounts for roughly half, like 60%, a bit more than half of the aggregate, and the within components for 40%. Okay, so this is kind of like, our starting point, the statistical decomposition. Now, given how, like, large are these differences across cohort, one may start wondering, well, what explains them? And so what we do, it is we bring in kind of like, additional data, first of all on, like, cohort level schooling, but then on, like, economic conditions in the country at the time where cohorts were growing up, and also we compile, like, a new data set of political events and educational reform. And we use this data essentially to show that events that affected, that increase the human capital during youth of a given birth cohort lead to, like, subsequent lower agricultural employment in adulthood. Okay, and so that is kind of like, our human capital interpretation of these cohort level differences. So now we have this cohort effect. We have an interpretation. The last natural step, it is to write down a model that provides kind of some interpretation. And so, in fact, what we do is we write down a model which is designed to map the statistical decomposition into the role of demand and supply of agricultural labor to understand, like, the aggregate. And so what we find, like, with the model, once we kind of, like, use this data with the model, we find that in partial equilibrium, meaning essentially keeping kind of, like, constant relative wages and the relative price of agricultural good, the shift in the supply of agricultural labor can explain as much as 40% of the aggregate. Okay, so that gives us a sense of how large was this shift in the supply of labor, again, driven in our interpretation by, like, increasing human capital. However, kind of like as expected, general equilibrium forces attenuate this direct effect. And so once we take, like, prices into account, we see that the shift in the supply can account by itself for 20% of the aggregate. All right, so that's it, kind of like, for the introduction. Now, like, in the next 30 to 35 minutes, I'm gonna go through, like, the 3 parts of the paper. I spend, like, some time guiding you through the statistical decomposition. I'm then gonna bring in additional data to interpret these cohort effects. And last, I'm gonna write down a model for quantification. Okay, so let's start with the statistical decomposition and unpacking structural change. So we use data, these micro level data, which are available from IPOMS International and the DHS. Of course, we do like, a lot of work to kind of be sure that the data are like, high quality and harmonize them. Although like, most of the work is already done by IPOMS and DHS. Our data set covers like, almost 70 countries for a total of almost like, 300 repeated cross sections and like, millions and millions of workers. We focus on males and we focus on age 25 to 59. Now, the reason to do this, it is that you want to kind of focus on a part of the life cycle where the labor force participation is roughly constant. And we know that that's true for males, it's not true for females, where like, labor force participation vary dramatically across countries, in particular, also like, more across the life cycle. Anyway, we have like, results for females in an appendix of the paper. We then like, what we do with the data, we literally simply just compute for every country J, every time period T, and every cohort C, the share of that cohort which is employed working in agriculture. Now, to give you a sense of kind of like, how our data is, I'm just going to show you kind of plot the raw data for a couple of countries. So this is Brazil. And on the x-axis, we have time. On the y-axis, we have agricultural employment. Now, like each one of these lines, which I'm going to now put in this picture, is one bird cohort, followed like, over time. So the first one here, this is the cohort born in 1920. And we observed them from the 1960 to 1907. So that is the time period in which they are in our data set, given our age restriction. And we see that following this cohort over time, their agricultural employment declines. So there is within cohort labor reallocation. Now, if I click once more, we add another cohort, the one born in 1930. What we see is the same pattern, that cohort that is within cohort reallocation, but also we see that if you compare these two cohorts in the same point in time, the younger cohort are less likely to work in agriculture. And so that is the between cohort reallocation components that I described in the introduction. We can kind of like, keep on clicking and adding more and more cohort. And we have this kind of like, overall picture of Brazil, where you can see these two forces, that there is like, within cohort reallocation driven by like, these slopes of the line, but also between cohort driven by essentially these jumps over here. Now let's put another country, this is like, Indonesia. For Indonesia, you see like a bit of a different picture actually, because if you follow one cohort over time, you see like, some cyclicality, but not really like, nothing much in terms of a trend, while instead you see kind of like, big jumps across cohorts. Now, these are two countries, we have 70 of them. I'm not gonna kind of spend the next like, hour showing you like, pictures for every single country. What we do it is essentially we want to just summarize this valuable information across all the countries. And the way we do it is we do it through like a fairly standard statistical decomposition. So how do we do it exactly? There are like two steps. The first step, we have on the left-hand side, the kind of agricultural cohort, sorry, the agricultural employment for a given cohort, the given time T, and the given country J. And then we run a regression separately for every country of this on year dummies and cohort dummies. Now, once we recover these year and cohort dummies, we can show this fairly trivial decomposition. Then you can decompose the aggregate in between two periods, so the change in the aggregate employment between period T+1 and T, into the difference in the year effect in the two periods, which is what we call a year component, and the cohort component, which essentially just captures the change in the cohort effects of the cohorts which are active as they are in the labor force in these two periods. And so now, like, we are equipped, like, we run this decomposition of our data, and we are equipped with a cohort and, a year and a cohort component for every country. So what I do in the next slide is simply, like, plot their histogram. So what do we get? So these are their histogram, and there are, like, two facts that I wanted to kind of zoom in. First, so like this is the histogram across all the countries. So first, you see that, like, most of these bars are to the left of the zero. So that means that in most of the countries in our data, both the year and the cohort component contribute to the aggregate labor allocation. That means that there is both kind of like, within cohort and between cohort forces of reallocation. So if you think of Brazil, Brazil would be like a country which sits like, here because there is like a steep year component and a little bit of a cohort component. If you think about like, Indonesia, Indonesia is like here because there's like 0 year component, but a strong cohort component, okay? But overall, both of these forces matter. Second, if you look at the sheer magnitude, the average year component and the average cohort component have similar magnitude. If anything, the cohort component is larger, meaning it explains a larger share of the aggregate. Now, probably many of you are thinking, okay, but like, how about age? Meaning, like once you compare 2 cohorts in the same year, of course, they also have different age. And the possible concern is that the relatively like, older cohort, they will be more likely to work in agriculture, not because they have different characteristics, but simply because mobility frictions kind of trap them there. So this is a like plausible concern, but what we actually show, like, our model kind of really gonna make it clear is that adding age controls actually can help attenuate this concern. How can we add age since they are collinear with year and the cohort? Well, we need a linear restriction, and the model provides guidance on which one is the exact linear restriction to use. And we are gonna use that essentially the age effect are 0 in the first few years. So why that makes sense? Like intuitively, the idea it is that, and again, the model formalizes this. I have a proposition showing you that in 20 minutes from now. The idea is that the mobility frictions are less likely kind of to bind early on, like, in the life cycle of a given cohort. Now, once we control for age, the result changed a little bit, kind of like as expected. In particular, now the year component matters more, is 60%, and the cohort component 40%. So why that's the case? Well, because in fact, some of the cohort effects were just capturing mobility frictions. Once we control for that, we isolate the pure part of the cohort effect that captures differences in competitive advantage, and that accounts for roughly 40% of the aggregate. Okay, so that's it for the statistical decomposition. So now we have like all this cohort effect, we want to interpret them. If you believe what we've done so far, you're kind of on board that younger cohorts seems to have a comparative advantage towards an agriculture, okay? Because that is what comes out from the cohort effect once you control for mobility frictions. Now the key question is, well, why do they have this comparative advantage towards agriculture? What explains this change over time? What we do next, it is essentially we bring different pieces of evidence to try to support the human capital interpretation. So the idea is that we're going to show the different events which affect human capital during youth, as measured by schooling, are going to lead to lower agricultural employment of that cohort during adulthood later on. So kind of like as a starting point, we can just look at the kind of cohort effect of schooling side by side. So this is what I showed you in the introduction. Young cohort have lower agricultural employment, so lower cohort effect. And this is using the same data, simply looking at average schooling. So what we see here, it is that younger cohort, of course, as well known, have more schooling. So you see kind of like the specular opposite relative to the cohort effect, which at least provides some suggestive evidence that maybe indeed what's driving lower agricultural employment of younger individuals is that they have more schooling. However, of course, this is consistent with some sort of trend guiding both this picture. So to improve on that, what we do is we can run within every country J a regression where we have on the left-hand side the cohort effect of a given cohort C. Then on the right-hand side, we have schooling. And also we control for a quadratic trend. So then our key kind of coefficient of interest is this beta here. We expect beta to be negative because we expect cohorts that have relatively more schooling relative to the trend to be less likely to work in agriculture, again, 20 to 30 years after. This picture here shows the beta for every single country in our data set. And what we see is that consistent with kind of the interpretation of human capital mattering, the betas are negative everywhere. Okay, so pretty much in every country around the world, the cohorts that are relatively more educated are also relatively less likely to work in agriculture. Of course, this is just kind of correlations. And then the question is, well, but what are the drivers of schooling choices of a given cohort? Well, we can investigate that a little bit. So the first thing that we do is we look at aggregate economic conditions for a given birth cohort when they were growing up. What this figure shows, it shows the marginal effect of kind of being exposed to relatively high GDP, so from essentially growing up in an economic boom, on schooling and on cohort effects. So this is kind of like fairly well known. Like schooling is a normal good if when a cohort is young, like in particular, you see that the effect peaks around age 10. The country is going through like an economic boom, then that cohort is going to be like more educated than the others. What is interesting it is that we see kind of like the opposite pattern if you look at cohort effect, which means that cohorts that grew up during like a boom, actually like again 30 years after, are less likely to be working in agriculture. Okay, so we think that here like the channel that kind of links economic conditions at youth and future agricultural employment is like human capital accumulation, which then changes the comparative advantage. As I mentioned, then to kind of put a little bit more evidence and more story of like what type of events affect cohort, we compiled a data set on educational reforms, okay, for like most of our countries. And then what we do is essentially we look at an event study by comparing cohorts that are affected or not by like an educational reform. So the left figure here shows schooling. And so we see that so the cohort like after the red line, these are the cohorts that are affected by the educational reform. And we see that consistent with what you will expect, if there is a reform of the schooling system, then cohorts are more educated. What is interesting is that then like those cohorts that are affected by the reform are also like less likely to be working in agriculture again, like 20 to 30 years after. And so again, like this suggests that a policy reform that affects schooling may actually contribute to structural transformation by increasing human capital and hence kind of tilting the comparative advantage and leading this cohort to move out of agriculture. Other events that are likely to kind of affect human capital accumulation during youth are like political events. So what we did again, we kind of compile like hand compile using Wikipedia and many other sources, kind of like a data set of different political events. And then we show how they affected cohort effect on schooling. We have many countries in the paper. For today, I'm going to focus on one example, which is Mozambique, and in particular, the independence war from Portugal. So this is kind of one of my favorite graphs. So what do we show here? On the x-axis, we have the birth year of a given cohort. And then we have two y-axes. We have the share of like agricultural employment. So this is the cohort effect, which is here in like gray. And then on the other y-axis, we have like the years of schooling, which is here in black. Kind of consistently what we've seen so far, like young cohort have like more schooling and like lower agricultural employment. What is interesting it is that kind of these two time series like really track each other with like similar trend breaks. And in particular, this group of cohort, the one born between 59 and 70, they like grew up being affected by like the independence war from Portugal, and so kind of that can clearly be seen like in the schooling, that the schooling years that kind of flatten up. You see that like instead of kind of keeping on increasing, essentially there was like flattening period because here like the independence war essentially disrupted the functioning of the schooling system. And like simultaneously, as you see this kind of flattening in the kind of growth of schooling years, you also see like flattening in the decline of the cohort effect. Again, like this kind of supported interpretation of thinking of like events that affect during youth human capital, at least as measured by schooling, but potentially also by like other sources of human capital. Schooling is just like one proxy of them, lead to consequently like different choices in terms of occupational choice and agricultural employment. So you have many more of like this type of events in the paper, but I'm not going to go through them for the interest of time. So everything said so far, we think of it as like interesting kind of correlations, but nothing it's kind of definite on a causal link between schooling and agricultural employment. So to like refine a little bit the causal interpretation, the last exercise that we do, it is we rely on like a very famous school construction program in Indonesia, the impress school construction, which has been kind of popularized by this extremely influential paper by Esther Duflo published on the AER. So the left-hand side graph here, this is essentially the same as in her paper. It shows the first stage. So these cohorts are the ones that are affected by the school construction. And here we exploit both cross cohort, but also kind of like, spatial variation in the treatment intensity of school construction across different areas in Indonesia. You see that as expected, if they build a lot of schools near you, you're more likely to go to school, and hence, like, there is a first stage. Then in her paper, like Esther Duflo looked at the left-hand side variables on wages. What we did is we simply replaced wages with a dummy for agricultural employment. And what we find is the right-hand side picture, that we see that cohorts that are affected by school construction are also less likely to work in agriculture. So again, like, this is simply, one particular case where we have tight causal identification. This shows this, like, causal negative relationship between schooling and agricultural employment. Just, you may be wondering whether this kind of magnitude are consistent with the pure correlational one, and the answer is, like, yes, actually the order of magnitude is very, very similar. Okay, so what have we done so far? Well, we brought a lot of data, which hopefully can, like, contributed to paint a coherent picture, supported the interpretation of like cohort effect as human capital, which may itself be like endogenous, but also like affected by kind of like economic conditions, policy or political event growing up. Of course, like, so far we have really pushed the idea that human capital changes the competitive advantage through, like, a change in relative productivity. I just want to spend, like, 30 seconds to be upfront that there is, like, another plausible interpretation that is that actually schooling shifted the preference for agricultural employment. So maybe, like, you went longer to school, you don't want to stay in the farm anymore. So of course that changes the implication for growth, but it doesn't change the implication for like the shift in the supply of agricultural labor. Because if people simply don't want to work in the farm anymore, that still essentially shows up as a decline in the supply of agricultural labor. Now, in the next kind of 15 minutes, what we're going to do is we're going to build a model that essentially we then use to quantify the role of this, like, human side. Just being, like, very upfront, as I did in the introduction, in the model, we're going to think of human capital as exogenous. And so the spirit of our exercise is like a structural accounting. So we're going to think of, like, just take this time series of human capital from the data and just try to see how much that time series of human capital increase can explain in terms of, like, aggregate labor reallocation. Okay, the model. And Federico, feel free to, like, interrupt me if there are questions, like, in the chat that you want to bring up, of course. Okay, so we have workers and firms. Let's start from, like, the worker side. So this we model like an economy with an OLG structure. Hence, there are going to be like n plus 1 overlapping cohort. They each have, like, equal mass. The key kind of, like, new components of our work, it is that there is, like, human capital heterogeneity, and in particular there is going to be, like, human capital heterogeneity both within and across cohorts. So this H is a human capital aggregate of an individual of type epsilon born in cohort C, which is simply a Cobb-Douglas of this epsilon, which essentially captures the heterogeneity within cohort in human capital, and it has a fixed distribution with a beta because it provides tractability. And this HC instead, it is, like, think of it as a human capital shifter in any given cohort. So this is going to be the cohort level human capital, which grows exogenously at the constant rate. So the way to think about, like, this underlying structure is that there is, like, OLG, like new cohort enter, old cohort exit, and there is this wave of human capital that kind of, like, moves over time, with, like, some dispersion within cohort, but also, like, a level that shifts over time. What individuals do? Well, they're forward-looking agents that have perfect foresight, and essentially they're going to decide in which sector to work, agriculture, non-agriculture, subject to some, like, mobility frictions, and they're going to do this choice simply to maximize the present discounted value of their wages. So the key is that in agriculture, all workers are identical. And in non-agriculture instead, they supply like, their human capital. So this naturally lead to sorting based on competitive advantage, where you see that the high human capital individuals are going to sort to the non-agricultural sectors. There are frictions of two types. There is a fixed cost to change sectors, and there is potentially a utility flow cost. And these frictions are constant over time, which is something important to keep in mind. And I'm happy to kind of go back to these assumptions and how it affects our interpretation, maybe like in the Q&A. So that's workers. Then we have firms. So there are two sectors, agriculture and agriculture. In each sector, there is like Cobb-Douglas production function. This is the one for agriculture, where you have like labor and land and a productivity term, and this is the one for non-agriculture. These are like revenue functions. So essentially, we can just multiply the output by relative prices, where P is the relative agricultural price, like super standard. The one thing which is kind of the innovation, it is that this labor aggregate comes from essentially the micro choices of all the different cohorts on which sector to work. In particular, the agricultural labor is simply the sum of all the people at work that choose to work in agriculture across all the different cohorts and all the different types. And the non-agricultural labor, it is that same sum, but weighted by the human capital, because efficiency unit kind of matters in agriculture. Markets are competitive, which means that individuals are simply paid the marginal product of labor in both agriculture and non-agriculture. And so here you see kind of already how there's going to be like equilibrium effect, because if people labor move out of agriculture, of course land is going to become relatively more abundant, which can increase the wage in agriculture. Okay, so I told you workers, I told you firm. Then last, what we need to do is we need to kind of close the model. To do that, we should specify a demand structure and how the market's clear. Essentially, what we do in the paper is we bypass this because we don't really care about it. The only thing that we really care about it is how agricultural price is determined. And we need to be log linear function, because that is what provides kind of analytical tractability. So what we do is we simply specify a log linear function for a relative agricultural price, which essentially encompasses in a reduced form all the previous theories that have been emphasized in the literature. You can think of this one as a log linear approximation across a fully around a fully micro-founded model in terms of demand and market clearing. And so what the agricultural price is going to determine by, well, demand for agricultural labor. So this is the standard kind of non-homothetic demand channel. Relative productivity, which is the kind of standard unbalanced productivity growth. The agricultural labor itself, because just that tells you the supply of agricultural good. And human capital, that matters because it can generate the income effect, but also it matters because it can change relative agricultural, so the relative productivity in the two sectors. Now, without going into the details, essentially, by playing around with these different, elasticities, we can just, encompass the previous theories. In particular, eta equals 0 is a small open economy, and we know from, the work by Matsuyama that is small open economy, unbalanced productivity growth is going to have different effect. Instead, when, eta is positive, then, depending on these different elasticity, we're going to have stronger or weaker kind of, price effect generated by unbalanced productivity growth. And that matters only for essentially for kind of the general equilibrium counterfactuals. Okay, so that's the model. Now, kind of the reason why we wrote the model the way we did is because it provides analytically tractable kind of formula for the labor reallocation out of agriculture, both at the aggregate and at the cohort level. So let's start by the aggregate. So this proposition shows that, so on the left-hand side, this is the rate of labor reallocation from agriculture. And this proposition shows that it depends on, first, the growth rate of relative productivity and of preferences. And so this is the classic theories of structural transformation have essentially only this term here. But also, the aggregate labor reallocation is going to depend on the human capital increase. So this is our new channel. Why? Well, because human capital increase changes the aggregate comparative advantage. The faster human capital increase, the more younger generations are going to be equipped with skills more valued out of agriculture, which then essentially kind of like shift the occupational choice. The other thing to notice is that kind of frictions don't show up anywhere. The reason is that frictions matter for agricultural employment, but not for the rate at which like it changes over time. So this kind of first proposition that like maps these different like primitives into aggregate labor reallocation. The second proposition is possibly the most important one because it's the one that links our model to the statistical exercise, to the empirics, which I've shown you before. And in particular, what we do is we can show that if you run the same kind of like regression that we run in the data, that is the one with the year effect, cohort effect, and properly normalized like restricted age dummies, then the year and cohort component, which I showed you before, identify kind of like primitive interpretable object of the model. Okay, so then again, this kind of like justifies the way in which we write our empirical specification, because once you put age dummies in the proper way, they control for kind of like the confounding role of frictions. Okay, so now we have the model, we characterize the theory. Now let's finally use it to quantify how much supply shifted and how much that contributed to the aggregate. As an intermediate step, I just show you what is supply and demand for agricultural labor in the model. So the agricultural labor supply, this comes from the individual's occupational choice, or from workers' occupational choice. And it is, of course, increasing in the relative wage. If like wage in agriculture is higher, more people want to work there. But also importantly, it is kind of like shifted by the aggregate human capital. I already mentioned this. If there is like more aggregate human capital, that affects the aggregate competitive advantage, hence leading more and more workers to be willing to work like out of agriculture. So this is, you see how kind of human capital shifts the supply. The demand for agricultural labor, that comes from like the firm side, from firm siding, plus kind of like replacing the endogenous relative agricultural price. And here you see that you just have like declining demand as a function of relative agricultural wage, like as expected. And also you see that kind of the typical channels in the literature show up. Plus also human capital show up here as well. Why? Because if cohorts have more human capital, that can generate like a shift in demand, in particular like a shift in the relative agricultural price through like income effects and again like relative productivity growth. So we have these two functions. Just as an illustration, we can just like plot them in a diagram. So like here you have your standard like supply function increasing. So like more agricultural labor if there is like higher relative wage in agriculture, and this is like the standard demand function decreasing. Now the standard kind of classic theories of structural transformation will essentially think of the demand function shifting inwards as countries grow. And so like as if the demand shift inward, you will see that kind of like agricultural employment go down. What instead we want to claim, it is we claim that the supply also shifted inward, like downward, sorry. Why the supply shift downward? Because we think that is kind of big increase in human capital led to that shift in the supply. And what we want to do, first we want to quantify by how much the supply shifted. And so in this picture, that will simply be like, comparing this point here and this point here. So one way to quantify the role of the supply shift, it is to look at how much simply the shift in supply would decrease the aggregate agricultural employment if we keep like relative wages and prices constant. Now, of course, that is like a pure partial equilibrium view. In general equilibrium, relative wage will adjust, so we will reach this point here. Plus, in general equilibrium, the demand itself may shift as a result of the supply change or the higher human capital. Why? Because I showed you before, higher human capital may change relative agricultural price, which in turn may kind of like shift the demand. And so then they kind of like, yeah.
Just real quick, you have 5 minutes. So
yeah, perfect. Okay. We are on track. I'm finally going to show you the result in the next slide. Okay, so then we want to like compare, like if you are interested in understanding the full aggregate effect in general equilibrium, you want to compare this point here with this point here. Okay, so that tells you essentially what would be like the new equilibrium once you take into account all the different kind of like price effect as a result of this like shift in supply, which we think is driven by like the increase in human capital. So that's what we're interested in understanding, like, blue line and red line. Now, the model essentially provides us like, a machinery to go from the empirical decomposition to these objects, okay? And how we can do that? Well, applying proposition 1 and 2, which I just showed you before. So here, and finally, I arrive at telling you kind of like, the two core results to take home. First, there has been like, a large shift in the supply of agricultural labor. So how do we see it? Well, an application of proposition 2 tell us that the supply shift, so what I showed you, like, the comparison between like, these 2 points, like I showed you in red before, is simply driven by the cohort component that we estimated once, like, once we had the proper age restriction. So then we can go back to the statistical decomposition, to those like 2 histograms which I showed you like 20 minutes ago. We can recall that the cohort component accounts for 40% of the aggregate, and hence we have our result. But now, like, it has a structural interpretation, that is, the pure shift in supply can account in partial equilibrium for 40% of the aggregate labor allocation across all countries. And so in that sense, this was a very large shift in the supply of agricultural labor. Now, second, we can look at the aggregate. Again, putting together proposition 1 and 2, we can express the aggregate effect, which was like, that blue segment we are interested in, as the cohort component multiplied by the general equilibrium multiplier, which is simply like, a function of like, a bunch of exogenous parameters, in particular, all those elasticities that you've seen before. So we have this. We just need to like, find a way to kind of quantify this GE multiplier. We have a couple of different approaches in the paper. One is like, pure calibration, which like, we plug in numbers from the literature. The other one, which is kind of our favorite approach, is essentially reduced form estimation, which really kind of like, use our data, and so it exploits kind of variation across time and countries in the kind of cohort component and aggregate reallocation to pin down this G multiplier. Now, whatever approach we use, we have comparable numbers that suggest that G forces dampen the aggregate effect, but don't kind of completely mitigate it. This big data is roughly kind of like 1/2. So then, if you put together the result of the previous slide, that is in partial equilibrium, supply accounts for 40%, with this estimate of the G multiplier, you're going to get that the pure shift in supply can account for as much as 20% of the total reallocation, which was kind of like our headline number. So that's it. Now let me just kind of conclude in the last minute. So what have we done in this paper? Well, first we have brought kind of some new empirical facts. We have shown that the new bird cohorts entering into the labor market is kind of like very important. It plays a key role into like explaining and understanding aggregate labor allocation. We then have provided like an interpretation of these facts. We have argued that the reason why we see that kind of this big difference across cohort is because the increase in human capital have shifted the comparative advantage of younger generations. We then design a model to interpret this statistical decomposition in a structural way. What we find it is once we use data and model together, we find that there was a very big kind of like large decline in the supply of agricultural workers. And then we quantify the impact of that decline by itself in terms of aggregate labor allocation, and show that it can explain as much as 20% once you take like full G into account. Now, as like a closing line for the literature of structural transformation, we believe that our result implied that like the human side should be like an important component, both like from a theoretical perspective, but also like in terms of policy discussion, because we want to kind of take into account that like policies that are going to affect human capital accumulation will also affect like structural transformation, and at least like differences across cohorts in terms of their agricultural employment. So thanks so much, and I'm really looking forward to hear like any comments or questions that you might have.
Great. Well, thank you for that presentation. That was really clear and helpful. So we're going to do the question and answer for about 15 minutes. Those of you who are participants, if you want to raise your hand So use the participant function and put your hand up, and I will unmute you when you do. Please do ask some questions. Oh, and I actually have one hand up already. I'm going to use, since I'm talking, I'm going to ask one of my questions first and give you all a little more time to get hands up. So Tommaso, I hear you on like thinking about the human capital side of structural transformation, and particularly these ideas of education. I'm a little more fuzzy on the political events, but I think I know your decompositions on human capital, but I wanted to understand where you think the other big pieces are coming from. In particular, I was thinking that there's been a lot of technological change in agriculture such that the supply, like the demand for agricultural workers has gone down a lot because you don't need as many to do, and actually like fewer workers are even more productive than they were before. And I just wanted to get a sense of that decomposition, and also like as that productivity change drives more, does that like make human capital more important or less important in your story?
Yeah. So very fair questions. There are a couple of things to say. First, like still, like the story that you are kind of describing, that is in particular like relatively faster productivity growth in agriculture, which leads to lower demand for workers in agriculture, that is perfectly present. So in our kind of statistical decomposition, it shows up as an year effect. So if you remember back in Brazil, why in Brazil you see that following a cohort over time, there is like lower and lower agricultural employment. It is exactly because Brazil actually is a perfect example, because we know that there has been like a big technological revolution. The average size of the plots have increased. They can mechanize, and all of these process essentially liberated workers from agriculture. And we see that is pinned down by following one bird cohort over time. And so then really kind of the logic, and for us, kind of the beauty of our approach, it is that we can isolate the two kind of forces within the same framework. But it's not that we are kind of not accounting for the demand side, which indeed still accounts for the overwhelming majority of aggregate labor allocation. Now there was another point important to kind of clarify, and maybe a bit more subtle, that is that you mentioned that the technological revolutions may actually change the relative return of human capital in the two sectors. So that we don't really have the channeling here. So we kind of play under the assumption that human capital is always more complementary with the technology out of agriculture. Now, while I think that there has been changes, of course, in the return overall of human capital in agriculture, I think that the fact that human capital is more valuable out of agriculture, I'm kind of fairly confident on supporting that assumption, because it is at least kind of coherent with the fact that in every single time period and every single country throughout history, we observe sorting. So you always look at agricultural employment are the one with lower education. You look at you track workers over time, you see who are the workers that move out of agriculture. They're always the ones that are more educated. You look at workers that relocate out of agriculture for exogenous reasons, you see that their human capital increases. So all of these supports that assumptions, but we don't kind of allow for it in the model.
All right, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. All right, so Parantap Basu, you should be unmuted. Oh, good. All right.
Thank you. That is good. That is very good. Yeah, this is a very interesting paper. So can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I have actually a lot of questions, but maybe just make it very short. Actually, I have two questions. So I'm looking at the Indian experience. So I'm from, my homeland is India. So I think the gist of this story is that there are more and more people getting educated, and therefore they don't want to stay in agriculture. They go to urban sector. But that's not what's happening in many places in India. If you look at the literacy rate, it's very low, right? And the question is that I don't see literacy as a variable anywhere sitting in your empirical analysis, unless I've missed it. So this is something I was wondering whether just this pool effect is sufficient. I don't quite see that. And second is a model-based question. You are assuming that the relative price of agriculture is an exogenous process, but I can see we're using a partial equilibrium framework. But when there is, if people get out of agriculture, there will be shortage of agricultural goods. the relative price of agriculture will rise, and there will be another second order effect or general effect which will pull this labor back to agriculture. So I asked this question, but it looks like you have a log linear representation, but I was expecting to see some kind of a market clearing condition for agricultural sector and also the labor market. There are two sectors, two markets, labor market and goods market. So there is no market clearing condition for agriculture.
There is. So let me start from the second question, and then I go to the first one.
Yeah.
By the way, thanks so much for asking this question. Actually, this is a great chance also to clarify, something about our approach. So this is general equilibrium because all the feedback that you mentioned are present there. So if if I go back to how the labor, how the relative agricultural price is, so this is a function of agricultural labor. And so this is the agricultural labor at time t. So over time, as labor move out of agriculture, that is of course going to reduce the supply of agricultural good and hence increase the relative price. So that force is absolutely here, and it is modulated by this elasticity eta. Now the labor market clearing is it's coming up from demand and supply of agricultural labor, and so there relative wages clear the market, the local labor market. The goods market, we don't model explicitly the clearing of it, but essentially what we have in mind here is that there can be clearing either internationally or locally, and depending on the assumption they're willing to make on this elasticity, you can encompass any possible type of labor market clearing. For example, if this eta, of goods market clearing for agricultural good. For example, if this eta you pick it to 0, then you think of the agricultural the market for agricultural goods at essentially not clearing locally but clearing internationally, and hence anything that affect your local economy does not affect the relative agricultural price. But if this eta is bigger than 0, then you'll have your standard local labor market clearing. So this is just reduced form representation, but we do have all these equilibrium forces that you just mentioned. Now the other question is about human capital growth in India. Was it there or not? Well, if you just look at educational attainment, there is big heterogeneity across states in India, of course, as you probably know even better than me, but you see big increase in educational attainment throughout the border. Now I'm not familiar with data on literacy. You're totally right that a big problem with India is that as educational attainment increased, schooling quality decreased, in particular in the rural area, and so that potentially may dampen the effect of the mapping between schooling into human capital. Here again, we're not saying that all that's happening is schooling increasing. We're just saying that that's one component. And yeah, I don't think I have anything more to add. But thanks so much for the questions.
If I can add one thing on this, so
please, Fede, yeah.
So the quantitative results that Tommaso showed are kind of averages across countries, but our exercise is very consistent with the idea that the growth in human capital and its impact may be very heterogeneous across all countries. And indeed, you can see our approach of using cohort effects to back out human capital as having the advantage of potentially including changes in human capital, which are not just, say, increases in formal schooling, which would be something that you can measure directly, but also maybe changes in quality, in early child human capital, in health, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, one, the change in human capital can be heterogeneous, and we do have country-specific results that we haven't showed in the interest of time. And two, you can really think about these cohort effects as absorbing a more general form of human capital that you could measure just with schooling, including literacy, for example, or other aspects.
Great. Okay, thank you all. So next question is, well, two things. One, I put in the chat the link to the informal conversation that starts right after this for a half an hour. So you have all that now. And now we have Netza Gunnar with a question. Go ahead, please.
Thomas, a quick question on this. You have the year effects and you have the cohort effects, and age effects for a set of countries. Do you know whether the relative importance of these are different? I mean, at different levels of development. Suppose you correlate this by GDP per capita at, you know, at the start of a cohort, or I mean, there might, I don't know, you saw this, you know, bar charts with the distribution. Is there any pattern there by the GDP per capita or something?
Yeah. No,
whether the relative importance changes through as the countries develop.
Absolutely. There is actually. So we haven't kind of like shown in here, but like, you know, the results are in the paper. So if you look at middle and low income countries, they actually have a larger role for the age effect, which then actually we can show like in the model, there is a kind of analytical mapping between the size of the friction and how much like the year effect increases once you control for age damage. And if you do that, you see that the friction is larger in low income countries, and then like, you know, followed by middle income countries, and then in the high income countries is close to zero almost. And so just to give you like in an order, like, you know, how large are this friction, we estimated that like, you know, for the lowest income country is roughly 0.4. What it means 0.4? It means that it essentially you're like, it binds you from moving out of agriculture in roughly 40% of the periods of your life. So between 25 and 60, think of it as like, you know, up to like, you know, 40, 45, you like, you know, the fixed cost, you think of it as being like, you know, washed out. So you will move out of agriculture if that is what like maximizes your income. But after like, you know, 45, essentially you will like, you know, really not be likely to move out of agriculture because the fixed cost is too large. So we definitely have this. We don't look, so in principle, we could look at whether this varies within one country over time, but then it becomes very tricky. Sure. Because like we really rely like, you know, on these frictions being constant to some like, you know, the derivation in the model. And so then like, you know, you could look at kind of like, you know, an interaction term, just like purely statistical. We have done that, and we actually see that this age effect, there is no like, you know, there is no evidence that they really like, you know, change dramatically over time within a country. We don't have that long time series, so we don't want to like, you know, speculate too much on that. But at least the cross-country evidence, I think, is very consistent with what we would expect, that is that frictions are more binding in low-income countries.
Thank you.
Okay.
No, thank you for the question.
All right, we have time for one more question. Don't be shy. All right, you all are too shy. So I'll go ahead. I've got one more that's a little bit, I think, beyond the scope of what you're doing, but it's always nice to have an expert opinion to extend your stuff. And maybe I misunderstood with the modeling, but it struck me that this is very country by country analysis, and yet agriculture is one of the more global trade markets, and also is shifted over time. I mean, you're talking about political events. There's political events that go across countries. Do you have any intuition on this if you go beyond like a small open economy and think more broadly about the global market? Because I mean, we've seen broadly human capital and education rising.
Yeah, it's good that I have just like, you know, 30 seconds to answer, because I don't really know what to answer yet. Right. So I think it's very interesting, and you know, like you can think of a lot, and there are a lot of interdependence. Actually, I was looking at it like, you know, last night. For the US, for example, is roughly, you know, 20% of agricultural goods are like, you know, imported or exported. I don't have that number like, you know, globally, but there is like, you know, clearly like, you know, growing interdependences, and it would be interesting both like, you know, as a source of shock potentially to kind of like, you know, tie down the identification, but also like, you know, in general, kind of try to see how, you know, like increasing human capital in one country may then like, you know, lead to specialization out of agriculture in that country, which then of course maybe need to rely more like on importing agricultural goods. I think is all extremely interesting. We haven't really kind of like, you know, thought much about it yet, but hopefully like, you know, in the next few steps in the agenda.
Yeah, no, that's really great. We've got the machinery to delve into it, so
exactly. So that's, yes, you know, hopefully
might as well use it. So,
exactly.
Yeah.
First, we try to publish one paper, and then we'll see.
Yep, sounds good. Okay, well, thank you. This has been a really great presentation, interesting research. I appreciate both of you being here, and all of those of you who participated and especially asked questions. So as I said, we're going to wrap it up here in the larger session and in the chat. If anyone wants to join in just to talk a little bit more with the co-authors, you can join us in that Zoom. Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. And we'll see you next Thursday. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
for having us here.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. I'll leave this on for a minute or two for people to click on the links since the chat will disappear.